Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, October 1st, 2025. Day one of the federal government shutdown. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers on furlough, White House preparing for layoffs, some government services suspended, and both parties blaming the other. We'll hear from Vice President JD Vance, congressional leaders, and some rank-and-file members of Congress who are explaining the situation to their constituents. Healthcare is one of the key issues in the shutdown. Democrats say Republicans are refusing to extend help to keep millions from seeing insurance costs skyrocket. Republicans say Democrats want to give healthcare to illegal immigrants. We'll talk to Newsweek politics reporter Daniel Gooding, who wrote a fact-check article on this. Maryland's Governor Wes Moore, a Democrat, talks about help his state is providing to those affected by the federal government shutdown. Trump administration says $18 billion for two big infrastructure projects in New York, the commuter train tunnel under the Hudson River and the 2nd Avenue subway line, being withheld to investigate what the Transportation Department calls discriminatory, unconstitutional contracting processes involving DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. A nominee for a seat on the National Labor Relations Board, who's currently chief labor counsel for the Boeing Corporation, gets tough questions at a Senate confirmation hearing from a Republican senator about a Boeing union contract dispute. And we'll get a preview of the Supreme Court case challenging President Donald Trump's worldwide tariffs, a Federalist Society event today looking at the new Supreme Court term, which starts Monday. Associated Press writes a vote to end the federal government shutdown hours after it began failed Wednesday, as Democrats in the Senate held firm to the party's demands to fund health care subsidies that President Donald Trump and Republicans refused to provide. The tally showed cracks in the Democrats' resolve, but the outcome also left no breakthrough. Blame was being cast on all sides on the first day of the shutdown. The White House and Congress failed to strike an agreement to keep programs and services open, throwing the country into a new cycle of uncertainty. At issue are the tax credits that have made health insurance through the Affordable Care Act more affordable for millions of people since the COVID-19 pandemic. The credits are set to expire at the end of the year if Congress doesn't extend them, which would more than double what subsidized enrollees currently pay for health insurance premiums, according to a KFF analysis. That was from Associated Press. The Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke this morning on the Senate floor.
So, Mr. President, today's October 1st, the first full day of Donald Trump's government shutdown. Donald Trump and Republicans have barreled us into a shutdown because they refuse to protect Americans' health care. It's clear that the way out of this shutdown is to sit down and negotiate with Democrats to address the looming health care crisis that faces tens of millions of American families. Democrats want to avert this crisis, but Republicans tried to bully us, and it's clear they can't. They don't have the votes. The way out of this is for Republicans to finally roll up their sleeves and get to work. Republicans need to get serious and start actually addressing the looming crisis and reopen the government. Now, why has all of this happened? Why are we here on October 1st? Because Republicans have tried to stick us with a partisan CR that fails to protect Americans' health care and does nothing to fix the health care mess that they created. It has now failed twice to get enough votes in this chamber. So Republicans need to negotiate with us. And Speaker Johnson's got to get his people here. If anyone wanted evidence as to who wanted this shutdown, just look at the fact that Johnson does not even have the House in session.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, today on the Senate floor, and the Senate then took another round of votes on the competing government funding proposals. The Democratic one failed 47 to 53, short of the 60 votes needed along party lines, and the Republican one also failed 55 to 45, also short of the 60 votes needed. That was almost party line. 3 Democratic caucus members voted yes. Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, and Angus King, an independent from Maine. And 1 Republican voted no, Rand Paul from Kentucky. Senator Angus King posted a video Tuesday night after a similar vote in which he voted yes on the Republican proposal.
I just came from the Senate floor where I took one of the most difficult votes I've taken since I've been in the Senate. I voted to keep the government open for a continuing resolution. The irony of this vote is many feel that this was an opportunity to stand up to Donald Trump, to vote no, and to fight back. The irony, the paradox is, by shutting the government, we're actually giving Donald Trump more power. And that was why I voted yes. I did not want to hand Donald Trump and Russell Vought and Stephen Miller additional power to decimate the federal government, to decimate the programs that are so important to so many people. Here is what Donald Trump said just this afternoon. We can do things during a shutdown that are irreversible, that are bad for them, he means the Democrats, like cutting vast numbers of people out, cutting things that they like, cutting programs that they like. We can do things medically and other ways, including benefits. We can cut numbers of people out. Maya Angelou once said, if someone tells you who they are, you should believe them. Donald Trump, in this quote, tells us what he plans to do if there's a shutdown, and it will not be good for the American people. This was a difficult vote, but in the end, I could not, in good conscience, vote to shut the government down and hand even greater power to the trio of Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, and Russell Vought. This was a vote of conscience on behalf of the state of Maine and the people of the United States.
Senator Angus King, independent from Maine, he caucuses with the Democrats, posting that video Tuesday night after he voted to keep the federal government open. That vote failed, and the federal government did close. And again, there was another vote on the same Republican government funding proposal today, and again, he voted yes, but it also failed again today, not getting the 60 votes required to pass. The Senate is in session on Thursday, but for no business, no legislative business, because of the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. So the next time they could take a vote to reopen the government would be on Friday. On this first day of the federal government shutdown, Senate and House Republican leaders held a news conference on the West Terrace of the U.S. Capitol, looking down the National Mall to the Washington Monument. Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican of Louisiana, said the Democrats are to blame for the government shutdown.
I'll just point out that today we're here on the west front of the Capitol. We're overlooking the National Mall. It's a beautiful sight that a lot of the American people will not be able to experience today. On a normal day, of course, you have tens of thousands of visitors here, family, you have school groups that come and visit. They walk these grounds. We have about 7,000 people who visit this Capitol each and every day. But today that's not going to be the case. Today, America's boys and girls will walk up to these doors and they'll see something different, a sign that says closed until further notice. And that's because at midnight, the Democrats followed through on their threat to shut down the United States government. As we speak here this morning, there are hundreds of thousands of federal workers who are getting their furlough notices. Nearly half of our civilian workforce is being sent home. These are hardworking Americans who work for our federal government. Our troops and our Border Patrol agents will have to go to work, but they'll be working without pay. Food assistance, veterans benefits, and vital support for women and children are all coming to a halt. Now, thankfully, President Trump is trying to mitigate the damage as much as possible. His administration is working to limit the harm to the American people, but the longer this goes on, the more pain will be inflicted because it is inevitable when the government shuts down. The sad thing about it is that every single bit of this was entirely avoidable. Democrats could have worked with us in a bipartisan manner to avert this unnecessary and very harmful shutdown. But instead, they did something that is rather shocking to us. They prioritized taxpayer-funded benefits for illegal aliens over keeping the government open for American citizens. They themselves positioned that as a binary choice, and it's patently absurd. Listen to what the Democrats are demanding. They demanded, in exchange for our simple, clean, 24-page bipartisan continuing resolution, the same one that Chuck Schumer and the Democrats voted for just a few months back in March. In exchange for that, they rejected it, and they demanded something else. They wanted us to add over $1.5 trillion in new federal spending, paid for, of course, by hardworking American taxpayers, simply for funding the government at current Biden level spending levels. We are not going to do that. We can't do that. We won't do it.
House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican of Louisiana, with other House and Senate Republican leaders. News conference Wednesday morning on the West Terrace of the U.S. Capitol building. There's a story from Politico. Senator Mike Rounds is floating a one-year extension of soon-to-expire Affordable Care Act subsidies, followed by a one-year phase-down to return the tax credits to pre-pandemic levels. Brown said about his push for one-year extension, the first year, all the states have to have an understanding of some stability to it. After that, he said, we can continue on this path that was there for pandemic purposes only. The article says the rough sketch from Rounds, which the South Dakota Republican outlined in a brief interview Tuesday, comes as the fate of enhanced health care credits has emerged as a key sticking point in the government funding fight. Rounds isn't advocating for an extension to be tied to the GOP's 7-week stopgap spending bill, but instead said it could be linked to a larger government funding measure that could pass separately sometime between October 1st and November 21st. That was from Politico about talks that were seen among a group of senators, including Rounds, on the Senate floor today by many reporters. At the White House, Vice President JD Vance joined the news conference with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt to talk about the government shutdown.
We all understand that Democrats and Republicans have policy disagreements. The Democrats want to do things. Look, when Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries were in here a couple of days ago, they made some suggestions that the president was more than happy to say, yes, let's sit down and talk about how we can solve the health care crisis that we inherited from the Biden administration. But it's one thing to say that we should solve the health care crisis for Americans. It's another thing to say that we're going to shut down the government unless we give the Democrats every single thing that they want, which, as Caroline says, includes giving billions of dollars of taxpayer funding for health care for illegal migrants. That's ridiculous. You don't have policy disagreements that serve as the basis for a government shutdown. Let's have the conversation about how to fix American health care, about how to make health care more accessible. As the president showed, he's more than willing to act on behalf of the American people for this very reason. What you don't do is say, unless you do exactly what we want to do as congressional Democrats, we're taken hostage. And the hostage, it turns out, is critical, essential services that the American people need. Caroline talked about some of it. Let me talk about some more. Our troops are not getting paid starting today because of the Chuck Schumer wing of the Democratic Party. We have people who require food assistance, low-income Americans who require food assistance, who will not get it unless we reopen the government, thanks to Chuck Schumer and his wing of the Democratic Party. We have flood insurance as we start hurricane season in the southeastern part of our country. That flood insurance is going to disappear because of Chuck Schumer and the far left of the Democratic Party. We need to reopen the government. Let's fix America's problems. Let's work together to solve them. But let's reopen the government before we have our negotiation about health care policy. That's what the American people demand, and that's certainly what the President of the United States wants. Let me make one final point. I think a lot of Americans are asking themselves, why did this happen? Why did the Democrats shut down the government despite, as Caroline said, voting on the exact same piece of legislation 6 months ago? And there are a lot of different spins that we can put on it, a lot of different answers that we could give, all of them true. One answer I already gave is that they want to give health care benefits to illegal aliens. That is true. They gave us legislative text that would have undone us cutting off health care benefits for illegal aliens. That's one of the things that they asked for. But the reality here, and let's be honest about the politics, is that Chuck Schumer is terrified she's going to get a primary challenge from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The reason why the American people's government is shut down is because Chuck Schumer is listening to the far left radicals in his own party because he's terrified of a primary challenge.
Vice President JD Vance speaking in the White House briefing room. Story from the New York Times. The government shutdown that began Wednesday morning suspended the work of hundreds of thousands of employees, disrupting a wide range of federal programs. Many more employees are required to report to work without pay until funding is restored. The Times article lists departments and agencies. The largest by percentage, Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, 89% of the 15,000 employees there furloughed. And by sheer numbers, Defense Department civilian workforce, almost 335,000 on furlough. It's a story from NBC News. Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vought told House Republicans on Wednesday, the first day of the government shutdown, that the Trump administration will start firing federal employees in the next 1 or 2 days, according to 2 GOP sources on the conference call. Vought, who issued a memo last week threatening mass firings in the federal workforce in the event of a shutdown, did not outlined specifics to Republicans about these plans and argued the layoffs would not be happening if it weren't for Democrats. That was from NBC News. Back to the White House briefing with the Vice President JD Vance. He was asked about possible federal employee layoffs.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and thank you for being here. Yesterday, President Trump said, as a result of the shutdown, we'll be laying off a lot of people that are going to be very affected, and the Democrats, they are going to be Democrats. Has the administration asked agencies to target federal workers who they believe to be Democrats in these reductions of forces?
We're not targeting federal agencies based on politics. We're targeting the people's government so that as much as possible of the essential services can continue to function. That is the question the president has asked the entire government is fundamentally, okay, we're in a shutdown. That causes some problems. The troops aren't getting paid. There's nothing that we can do about that while the government is shut down. But there are essential services that we want to make sure as much as possible they still continue to function. That is the principle that's driving us forward during this shutdown. It's going to continue to be the principle that drives us forward. But let's be honest. If this thing drags on for another few days or, God forbid, another few weeks, we are going to have to lay people off. We're going to have to save money in some places so the essential services don't get turned off in other places. That is the reality of the government shutdown that Chuck Schumer and the Democrats have foisted upon the administration.
Vice President JD Vance at a White House news conference. OMB Director Russ Vogt writing on X today, nearly $8 billion in green new scam funding to fuel the left's climate agenda is being canceled. More info to come from the Energy Department. The projects were in the following states: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. That was the post from OMB Director Russ Vogt. On Capitol Hill, the U.S. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, asked about those cuts and the potential federal worker layoffs.
Russ Vogt just spoke to House Republicans on a call, says that these firings are likely to start within the next 48 hours. Also said that WIC is going to run out of money within the next week. And he just posted that $8 billion of green energy will actually be cut immediately. And it's going to affect 16 states, all of them which have either Democratic leaders or Democratic majorities in their state houses or Senate. What's your response to that?
These are all things that the Trump administration has been doing since January 20th. The mass firings of federal workers, Trump administration has been engaging in this since January 20th. Targeting the clean energy economy, Republicans have been doing that since January 20th and assaulted the clean energy economy and the creation of good-paying American jobs in their one big ugly bill. Trump administration has been killing jobs. This is a job-killing administration. Job creation is down, but you know what's up? Costs. They promised to lower costs on day one. Costs aren't going down. Costs are going up. Inflation is going up under the Trump administration. And one of the reasons why Democrats are fighting hard at this moment is because unless we extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits, more than 20 million Americans in a matter of days are about to experience the reality of dramatically increased premiums, copays, and deductibles. Many of them will experience medical bankruptcy as a result. That's why Democrats are fighting hard on behalf of everyday Americans. I'll yield to Catherine to talk about the WIC issue. But in every other shutdown that Republicans have caused, including in the 35-day shutdown that Donald Trump presided over in 2018 and 2019, funding for women, infants, and children, their health, their nutrition, and their well-being was maintained. It was maintained. In every other shutdown, the reason why the Trump administration is threatening now to cut funding for women, infants, and children is because they can't stand that program. They're on the side of their billionaire buddies. They've been running the largest pay-to-play scheme in American history. And Exhibit A of that was their one big ugly bill, which is now law. Largest cut to Medicaid in American history. And they stole food from the mouths of hungry children women, veterans, and seniors, and all of this was done to provide massive tax breaks to their billionaire donors. We're fighting for the health care of the American people. They're fighting for their billionaire donors, their friends and family plan, which has been all about enriching the lifestyles of the rich and shameless from the very beginning of the Trump administration. So all this talk that we see right now, as if it has anything to do with the shutdown that Republicans have caused, no, it's their ideology. Cruelty is the point when it comes to the Republican Party.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, news conference on Capitol Hill. Headline at Newsweek, fact check, are Dems shutting government over illegal immigrant health care? Joining us now is Newsweek politics reporter Dan Gooding, who wrote that article. Thank you for being with us. This is something that Republicans have been saying constantly, from the president and vice president to the House Speaker. What did you find?
Yeah, so this is, like you say, something that's been talked about for several days in the lead up to last night's shutdown. And this kind of issue around benefits for illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, has been something that's been a talking point for the last year or so in the lead up to the election. I wanted to know, what were Democrats actually saying? What are they calling for? And you know, some of the tension here does come down to healthcare and healthcare provisions, specifically around the Affordable Care Act and Medicare and Medicaid. But they're saying we're not trying to give healthcare to those who are ineligible, which are people without legal status here in the U.S. And so this is kind of where it all boils down to, I think, is an issue around language, around how we talk about immigrants here in the U.S.
So you're saying the benefits that the Democrats want to restore would be going to non-citizens, but people who are in the U.S. legally?
Yeah, so this is kind of, I mean, we sort of already had a bit of this discussion in the lead up to kind of the main budget bill earlier this year in the summer. But essentially what they want to restore is kind of subsidies around the Affordable Care Act and so on, which do apply to people with green cards. And also, until the bill earlier this year, refugees and asylees, people here with temporary protected status, all people who have come here legally and are allowed to access these programs, because often they're paying into them as well through taxes.
Now, Republicans know this, but they are still saying that there are benefits that are going to illegal immigrants. What evidence are they pointing to?
So they're pointing to, and this is kind of coming up particularly today, even in the aftermath of the shutdown, is state programs. So some states, New York, for example, does provide some health care benefits through Medicare, Medicaid funding to people regardless of their immigration status. And I think this is where Republicans are getting caught up on, because they don't believe that that should be happening. They're saying if you are here illegally, you don't have legal status, you shouldn't be able to access government programs. The difficulty is we're talking about federal government funding here. This comes from state programs, and it's money that has been given to states, and they can do what they want with it. And some choose not to offer these programs, and some do. And so this seems to be where we're at, this standoff between the two parties here on this issue.
Why has this become the debate over a government shutdown? Is it being driven by the Republicans? Do they want to talk about illegal immigrants?
I think, quite often we come back to that issue around immigration. That has obviously been a huge policy point for President Trump and for the Republican Party over the last couple of years. But I think this is because the Democrats are saying we want to ensure that these subsidies, these provisions continue, some just through the end of the year, some which would be lost in a couple of years just after the midterms, in fact. And so, in a way, nobody is helping this situation, because the Democrats are saying, you're not hearing us on this point, and Republicans are insisting that they are hearing them and refusing to budge. And so I think, in a way, it so happens to be about immigrants, but not necessarily the reason for driving it in the first place.
Dan Gooding, politics reporter with Newsweek. You can find his article at newsweek.com. And by the way, he gives the Dems shutting government over illegal health care a false in the fact check. And he's on X at Dan Gooding. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Happy to chat.
You're listening to Washington Today. Politico writes that during the last partial government shutdown, which began at the very end of 2018 and concluded 35 days later, a legislative branch appropriations bill had already been enacted, which allowed Capitol Hill to function without interruption. This time, none of the annual government funding measures have been signed into law. Those who worked in the Capitol complex under the same conditions in 2013, when the government was shut for 17 days, will recall extensive waits to enter office buildings, closed parking garages, skip paychecks, and tourists distraught over canceled tours. 13 years later, things will look a little different. House and Senate employees, for instance, are now guaranteed back pay under law, even if they must miss a paycheck during the shutdown. That could lead to fewer furloughs, with lawmakers more confident that their staffer will eventually be made whole. But the bathrooms around the complex will still go uncleaned, and it could require a longer walk to grab a cup of coffee. Reporting from Politico. Congresswoman Sherry Biggs, Republican from South Carolina, posted this audio message on X to her constituents about the shutdown.
Hi, friends. This is Congresswoman Sherry Biggs with an important message. The federal government is now in full shutdown. I want you to know that this was entirely avoidable. I stood with President Trump and with my Republican colleagues to keep the government open. We supported a simple and clean plan to make sure that our troops and our veterans and our border agents were paid, and the Democrats completely rejected that plan. Instead, they demanded over $1.5 trillion in far-left policies that have absolutely nothing to do with keeping the lights on. That included taxpayer-funded health care for illegal immigrants, DEI programs for foreign countries, and cuts to our rural hospitals. Now our service members, our families, and our seniors are paying the price. Food assistance and housing programs are at risk, and federal workers are being forced to go without pay. This is not leadership. It's reckless politics. I'll keep standing strong for South Carolina families and pushing to get the government back to work. If you're affected or if you need help with a federal agency, please don't hesitate to contact our office, and we'll get through this together.
Congresswoman Sherry Biggs, Republican from South Carolina, posting that audio message today. U.S. House Democrats have been broadcasting a live stream on this first day of the federal government shutdown. Their members coming in to talk about the impact, both of the shutdown and their demand of adding health care provisions to a government funding bill, extending Obamacare insurance premium, enhanced subsidies, and restoring $1 trillion in Medicaid funding. Congresswoman Lori Trahan, Democrat from Massachusetts, was on this morning.
Deep disappointment that Republicans aren't here in Washington. As the government shut down at 12:01 this morning, and leading up to that, our Republican colleagues were not here. They were nowhere to be found to negotiate a deal to prevent this from happening. And so, it's a grim day for our country. Shutdowns benefit no one. I think we're all eager to get back to the Capitol, to get back to work, to have those conversations so that, we can mitigate the devastation that not just that a shutdown creates, but also what these healthcare cuts are causing. So, Shelley, you ask about Massachusetts. I mean, we, of course, know that if Republicans don't come to the table, if we don't act, healthcare prices are just going to surge in every state across our country. In my home state of Massachusetts, 240,000 residents stand to lose healthcare coverage, including 65,000 due to the expiring ACA premium tax credits. Another 337,000 residents will just see their health care costs skyrocket without an extension of those credits, which is why this timing is so important. Everyone says, we'll open up the government and then we'll negotiate. They don't end they don't expire until the end of the year. But that is not dealing in reality, because we know that insurance companies are going to be mailing out their rates for next year. They're doing that now, today, October 1st, because re-enrollment starts on November 1st. And so without an extension, without predictability or certainty, we know what happens. Those premiums are going to go up.
Congresswoman Lori Trahan, Democrat from Massachusetts, on a House Democratic Caucus live stream that was running all day, talking about the government shutdown. She referred to Shelley Pingree, Democrat from Maine, joining her. The Democratic members coming in twos and threes to discuss the shutdown. Almost one full day into the government shutdown, potential effects, meaning federal employees going without a paycheck, hundreds of thousands still have to go to work. ABC News article says ICE agents also going without pay. National parks could close. The Smithsonian museums also typically closing within a few days. About 2 million U.S. troops forced to work without pay. Federal contractors as well, so janitors and security guards not required to work and are guaranteed a back pay. Same article says that other states will also feel the impacts. About 85% of federal employees work outside Washington, D.C. Representative Nathaniel Moran represents Texas' 1st District. He's a Republican. He was interviewed today on KYTX TV, CBS 19 in Tyler, Texas, about the shutdown.
These Texans waking up wanting to know what's the immediate impact, though, to their family.
Yeah, as you said, there's going to be a lot of furloughs that happen. And as we know, government shutdowns do not save any money ultimately. I don't seek a shutdown, but neither do I fear it. And certainly I'm not going to roll over to unreasonable demands by the Democrats to prevent a shutdown. We provided a clean CR to the Democrats several weeks ago. The House Republicans passed that and sent it to the Senate that would extend funding until November 21st. That was a very reasonable position to take to keep government going while we negotiated on these other matters that they want to raise. But they're being completely unreasonable in their demands. They're demanding not just to unroll all of the $1.1 trillion worth of waste, fraud, and abuse savings that we got in the working families tax cuts, but some of that includes like a $50 billion provision for rural health care. That's an impact on East Texans. East Texans are likely going to see a little slower service when it comes to Social Security and HHS. HHS is likely going to have about 40% of their employees furloughed or more. They're going to see TSA problems. They're going to see maybe some issues with air traffic control, because a lot of these folks call in since they're not getting paid during this time frame, even though they're having to work. And so it does create a hardship. It's going to create a hardship on a number of veterans and military families, because when we get to payday, they're not going to get paid, even though they're called on to work, and that's simply not the right direction to go. Again, we want to be reasonable. The Democrats have been unreasonable through this process.
Congressman Nathaniel Moran, Republican from Texas, speaking from Washington to CBS 19, a TV station out of Tyler, Texas, in the east part of the state. More on the federal government shutdown when Washington Today continues in a moment.
The weekly podcast is a unique offering from C-SPAN. We record it right here in the C-SPAN radio studios in beautiful downtown Capitol Hill. In a town where extremes get so much attention, this isn't more extreme opinion, it's extreme history, connecting the old with the new. Hear what's happening right now against the backdrop of the history you know. So listen, follow, and enjoy the C-SPAN radio podcast, The Weekly. And have friends and family who love political history and even love C-SPAN's coverage of politics? Tell them about it too. Find C-SPAN's The Weekly wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. ABC 7 in New York writes that President Donald Trump's administration said Wednesday it was putting a hold on roughly $18 billion to fund a new rail tunnel beneath the Hudson River between New York City and New Jersey, and an extension of the city's 2nd Avenue subway because of the government shutdown. White House Budget Director Russ Vought said on a post on X that the step was taken due to the Republican administration's belief the money was based on unconstitutional diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. In a statement, the U.S. Transportation Department said that it had been reviewing whether any unconstitutional practices were occurring in the two massive infrastructure projects, but that the federal government shutdown had forced it to furlough the staffers conducting the review. Statement said this is another unfortunate casualty of radical Democrats' reckless decision to hold the government hostage to give illegal immigrants benefits. Reporting from ABC 7 in New York. Both the House and Senate Democratic leaders are from New York. Chuck Schumer, the senator, and Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Senator Schumer writing on X, obstructing these projects is stupid and counterproductive because they create tens of thousands of great jobs and are essential for a strong regional and national economy. And Congressman Hakeem Jeffries was asked about it at a news conference in Washington, D.C.
I want to get your reaction to Russ Vought announcing this $18 billion hold on infrastructure projects in New York City. Do you think you're personally being targeted?
The Trump administration is targeting the jobs, thousands of jobs, of hard-working Americans, working-class Americans, and blue-collar Americans who are going to lose the ability to work at the 2nd Avenue subway site or at the other project that has been canceled related to the Cross Harbor Tunnel. That's consistent with what the Trump administration has consistently done throughout their time in office. Lose jobs, cause economic pain and hardship for the American people. It's shameful, but it's very consistent with the Trump administration's track record of failing on the economy and targeting working-class Americans.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, minority leader, news conference on Capitol Hill. Trump administration tying the withholding of the $18 billion for the two big infrastructure projects in New York to the federal government shutdown. Maryland Governor Wes Moore, a Democrat, held a news conference in Annapolis, Maryland, talking about the government shutdown and what his state will do to alleviate any harm to his residents.
I would like to briefly discuss 3 immediate actions that we are taking now to make sure we're protecting Marylanders during this unneeded and unnecessary shutdown. First, I've directed state agencies to employ contingency plans that will help to make sure that federal programs can continue to operate in our state for now. We will ensure that state employees supported with federal funding continue to get paid for as long as possible. Federal programs administered by the state will continue to support working families through Medicaid and SNAP and TANF. We will also provide greater flexibility to Head Start programs and ensure that veterans maintain access to essential resources. But I do want to be very clear. The longer this unnecessary federal government shutdown goes on, the harder it is for us to keep services going. We will continue to monitor the situation closely, and we will adjust accordingly. Second, we are working with the private sector to shield federal workers impacted by this shutdown from eviction, foreclosure, and utility shutoffs. This morning, I sent letters to the state judiciary and our state utility companies reminding them of their statutory legal protections for federal, state, and local government employees who are not receiving a paycheck or are at risk of eviction or foreclosure. And third, we are protecting and expanding emergency assistance programs for federal employees. if you are a furloughed worker, you may be eligible for unemployment insurance. Those eligible for unemployment will repay the funds once they start receiving a paycheck again. We've also worked with our credit unions and also our banks to offer financial assistance and payment flexibility for Marylanders who are affected by the shutdown. We are extending support for our landmark Feds to Eds programs, connecting Marylanders with federal government experience to a fulfilling career in education. And federal workers who want to learn more about emergency resources should go to go.md.gov/federal shutdown.
Governor Wes Moore, Democrat from Maryland, speaking at a news conference in Annapolis. Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, posting on his personal X account, Schumer shut the government down because he's controlled by the progressive left. So are Kaine and Warner. No Virginian should be supporting this shutdown, referring to the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and the two U.S. Senators from Virginia, Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, all Democrats. Bloomberg Law reports that President Donald Trump's nominees to fill 2 of the 4 empty National Labor Relations Board seats told a Senate panel that they'll decide cases independently regardless of Trump's prior termination of a board member. If the Supreme Court ultimately decides that the president has the removal authority that he claims to have, I will continue to interpret the National Labor Relations Act as I always would have done so, and the president can just discharge me. James Murphy, a longtime NLRB staffer who came out of retirement to become a board member, testified Wednesday. Scott Mayer, chief labor counsel at the Boeing Company, said he agreed with Murphy. The nominees appeared to navigate their hearing before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions without saying anything guaranteed to doom their chances to join the NLRB, although Mayer did face tough questions about an ongoing strike at a Boeing facility that's raised the ire of a Republican on the panel. That was from Bloomberg Law, and that Republican was Josh Hawley of Missouri. C-SPAN covered this hearing.
So my question is what do you think is a fair resolution to this dispute? And we've got 3,000 plus Missourians who are currently effectively out of a job. They haven't had a significant wage increase in years. They need to be able to afford to pay rent, to put food on the table for their families, get their health care. I mean, is your company going to do right by these workers? You can understand why I've got a significant interest in this. This matters a lot for my state. It matters a lot for these workers and their families. There's a lot of people.
Certainly, Senator, I agree. It matters a lot. It matters to our hardworking employees, our hardworking the members of the IAM. I know the concept of fairness is an elusive one. What I will tell you is that the union and the company reached an agreement at the end of July. As I said earlier, I'm not involved in that negotiation.
Well, I mean, is the concept of fairness you say is elusive? Let me ask you this. In 2024, David Calhoun, that wasn't a question, I'm just quoting you. In 2024, David Calhoun, who's your executive at the time, got $32.8 million in compensation in a year. $32.8 million. That was a 45% increase over the previous year. At that point in time, your planes were literally falling out of the sky in pieces, and you weren't paying your workers. Is that fair?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on executive compensation.
Well, you're the chief labor counsel.
I am the chief labor counsel.
Were you involved in the settling the machinist strike in Seattle, I think it was?
Yes, Senator, I was involved in that negotiation.
Okay. Do you remember what the contract was you finally gave the Seattle machinists?
I remember parts of it. Yeah, I can't.
Wage increase, 38% general wage increase over 4 years, plus the option of a $12,000 one-time ratification bonus or a $7,000 ratification bonus and a $5,000 401k contribution. Does that sound roughly correct?
That sounds roughly correct.
Okay. Why wouldn't you just do that for the folks in St. Louis?
Senator, every negotiation is different.
Well, plainly so, because what you're offering to my constituents is a fraction of that. And I guess I just don't understand why. I mean, is it that what's different about the folks in Missouri?
It's not a question of difference about the folks in Missouri. It's a question about
You just said a minute ago, fairness is elusive. I mean, it does seem to be elusive for the Missouri strikers.
Senator, fairness is a matter of what the parties ultimately agree to.
Scott Mayer is nominated for a seat on the National Labor Relations Board, currently Chief Labor Counsel at the Boeing Corporation, questioned by Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, at today's Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee confirmation hearing. Also testifying today, another of President Trump's nominees to the NLRB and a nominee for Assistant Labor Secretary. Again, from the Bloomberg Law article on the hearing, the NLRB has been below the minimum number of members needed to fully operate following President Trump's dismissal of Democratic member Gwen Wilcox. The NLRB dropped to just one member, a Democrat, at the end of August. When then-Chair Marvin Kaplan's second term expired, the board is currently without a chair. The issue of member independence looms large in light of Wilcox's unprecedented dismissal, as well as Trump's February executive order claiming direct control of independent agencies like the NLRB, including their interpretation of the law. That was from Bloomberg Law. The Federalist Society's faculty division and practice groups hosted a panel at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington today, previewing the upcoming Supreme Court term, which begins in 5 days, the first Monday in October. One high-profile case is Learning Resources, Inc. v. Trump, challenging President Trump's tariffs put in place under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Panelist Joanne Sagar, partner at Hogan Lovells for Litigation, Arbitration, and Employment, was asked about this case by the moderator Amy Howe of SCOTUS blog.
The legal arguments have focused on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, I think is what everyone's calling it as shorthand, and it authorizes the president to regulate the importation of any foreign property. And that authority can be exercised, as the name implies, during a national emergency. So that's why it's the Emergency Economic Powers Act. And after the president has declared a national emergency, IEEPA authority can be used to deal with unusual and extraordinary threats to the national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the United States. And the president, in this instance, used IEEPA to impose drug trafficking tariffs on basically all goods from Mexico, Canada, and China, purportedly because those countries had contributed to the flow of drugs into this country. And second, the president imposed reciprocal tariffs on basically every other country because he was trying to address the negative effects of large and persistent trade deficits. There are a lot of arguments that the parties make in the case. It's kind of one of those cases where everyone's saying everything all at once. I think that the arguments are going to focus on one particular argument, which was maybe the best argument that the people who are being regulated have to offer, which is that the question of whether the power to regulate imports encompasses the power to impose tariffs, which are slightly different things, arguably. The challengers say that the president's power to regulate imports doesn't encompass this power because IEEPA conspicuously omits any mention of tariffs. It says that the president can regulate imports, but doesn't say that the president can impose tariffs on those imports. And every time Congress has expressly given the president power to impose tariffs, Congress has actually said, I'm giving you the power to impose tariffs, and it has imposed really strict sort of temporal and subject matter restrictions around that. It tends to be a very specific grant of authority and power, and in this case, IEEPA is very broad and unspecific, and so the challengers say this is really different from every other circumstance in which we've agreed that the president could impose tariffs. And the government's primary response is that the greater includes the lesser. So if you have the power to regulate, that is to control or adjust by rule, the import of goods, you also have the power to impose tariffs on it, because that is one way in which we regulate, and everybody understands the ordinary meaning of the term regulate. And the government relies on really, really old but very foundational authorities like Gibbons v. Ogden, just fundamental understandings of the president's powers and the Congress's role and what exactly it means when the president has the authority to do something.
Joanne Sagar, an attorney, being questioned by Amy Howe of SCOTUS blog, moderating a panel hosted by the Federalist Society today looking at the new Supreme Court term, which begins on Monday. An article from Flexport about the case you just heard says the Supreme Court could rule that IEEPA authorized the president to impose the tariffs or does not give the authority during non-war emergencies. But the court may also remand the case back to lower courts to evaluate the specific legality of how these tariffs were implemented. meaning the litigation could stretch on for years. Argument in the case scheduled for November 5th. Also today, CNN writing the Supreme Court agreed Wednesday to decide whether President Donald Trump can temporarily fire Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve, setting up a blockbuster showdown over the independence of an agency with vast power over the American economy. Cook will remain on the job until the court holds oral arguments set for January and decides what to do with the president's appeal. That move came despite Trump's request for Cook to be removed immediately. That was from CNN. Wall Street today, the Dow up 43, NASDAQ up 95, and S&P up 22. And CNBC writes the S&P 500 closed at a record high on Wednesday as traders were hopeful that a U.S. federal government shutdown would be brief and possibly have little impact on the economy. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. We'll send you the stories making headlines in Washington every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.